France just threatened to strike uranium mines in one of Africa's poorest countries. Not sanction, not negotiate, strike. Because buried beneath Niger soil is the fuel powering French nuclear reactors. And Paris just watched a military government try to take it back. Now Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré has his forces on high alert. A Sahel military alliance is mobilizing. And the world is pretending this is just a mining dispute. It is not. This is a former colonial empire threatening war to keep the lights on in Paris, while Niger stays in the dark. Watch what happens next. The continent of Africa sits on approximately 30% of the world's known mineral reserves. But in the Sahel, that vast, dusty corridor stretching between the Sahara Desert and the Sudan Savannah, one resource has quietly held the fate of nations in its hands for decades. Uranium. Specifically, the uranium buried beneath the red soil of Niger, a landlocked country that most of the world barely registers on its radar. That invisibility is precisely the point. Because what is happening in Niger right now, behind closed diplomatic doors, across military checkpoints, and inside the boardrooms of Paris, is one of the most consequential resource confrontations the African continent has seen in a generation. France has signaled it may take decisive action over uranium assets in Niger. Let that land for a moment. A former colonial power threatening consequences over mineral wealth in a country that is, by every measurable standard, among the poorest on Earth. A country whose population has among the lowest per capita income on the planet. And yet beneath its ground lies enough uranium to keep French nuclear reactors humming for years. This is not a background story. This is the central contradiction of 21st century geopolitics playing out in real time, with troops repositioning, alliances shifting, and the fragile architecture of West African security beginning to crack under the pressure. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand what uranium actually means, not in the abstract, but in the cold, strategic calculus of French energy policy. France is one of the most nuclear-dependent nations on Earth. Approximately 70% of its electricity comes from nuclear power plants. That is not a coincidence of geography or ideology. It is the result of deliberate policy decisions made after the 1970s oil crisis. Decisions that locked Paris into a long-term dependency on nuclear fuel. And for decades, a significant portion of that fuel came from Niger. Two strategic uranium mining sites in Niger, long operated under the umbrella of the French nuclear giant Orano, formerly known as Areva, have functioned as critical links in France's energy supply chain. When Paris looks at Niger, it does not only see a former colony, it sees a fuel line. And that fuel line is now under direct threat. The crisis formally accelerated after Niger's military takeover in July 2023, when General Abdourahamane Tiani seized power from democratically elected President Mohamed Bazoum. The coup sent shockwaves through the international community, but the shockwaves that mattered most were not the ones broadcast on television. They were the ones felt in the corridors of the French energy sector, in the strategic planning offices of the Élysée Palace, and in the conference rooms of Orano's executive leadership. Because within months of that military takeover, Niger's new military government began making moves. Moves that, taken individually, might seem like administrative reshuffling. Taken together, they represent something far more radical. A systematic assertion of national sovereignty over resources that France has long treated as part of its strategic patrimony. Niger's junta moved to assert full control over its mining operations. The framing chosen by Niamey was deliberate and politically loaded. This was not theft, they insisted. This was not chaos. This was an act of national sovereignty. And that framing matters enormously, because it taps into a vein of political sentiment that runs far deeper than any single government or military council. Across the Sahel, across West Africa, and increasingly across the broader African continent, there is a generation of citizens, young, digitally connected, politically engaged, who are done waiting for the promises of post-colonial partnership to materialize. They have watched their governments sign extraction agreements that generate wealth measured in billions, while their populations remain trapped in poverty measured in single digits of per capita income. They have watched foreign companies operate on their soil under legal frameworks negotiated in foreign capitals. And they have concluded that the system was not designed to benefit them. Niger's junta did not invent this sentiment. They weaponized it. And in doing so, they handed France a problem that military force alone cannot solve. Paris, however, was not prepared to simply watch its nuclear supply chain restructured by a government it does not recognize. French officials warned that any unilateral transfer or seizure of contracted uranium assets could trigger severe consequences. The language was deliberate in its vagueness. Severe consequences is the diplomatic equivalent of a raised fist. It is a threat designed to be interpreted broadly, to communicate resolve without committing to specifics. But that very vagueness is also a strategic vulnerability, because it invites the question, what can France actually do? Military intervention? The political cost, both domestically and internationally, would be enormous. And France has already withdrawn its military forces from Mali, Burkina Faso, and most recently Niger itself, after being formally expelled by juntas that mirrored Tiani's nationalist posture. Economic sanctions? Niger is already one of the poorest countries on earth. Sanctioning a population into further misery to protect uranium contracts is not a policy that plays well in the court of international opinion, particularly as African nations grow increasingly vocal in multilateral forums. This is where the stakes become genuinely complex. France is operating with a shrinking toolkit, threatening consequences it may not be in a position to deliver. And Niger knows it. This is not incidental. The timing and the rhetoric of Niamey's moves suggest strategic calculation, not impulsive nationalism. The junta has watched the French retreat for Mali. It has watched Burkina Faso expel French forces. It has observed how the architecture of French military presence in the Sahel, the so-called Operation Barkhane, once the backbone of French counterterrorism strategy in the region, has been systematically dismantled not by superior firepower, but by political will. The message the Sahel juntas have absorbed is this: France will negotiate, and France will eventually withdraw. The question is not whether Paris retreats, but under what terms. Niger is attempting to ensure those terms include control over its own uranium. But the story does not stop at Niger's borders. The Alliance of Sahel States has emerged as the structural framework through which the region's military governments are coordinating their political and security postures. The alliance, comprising Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, was formally established in the aftermath of the coups that swept through each country, born from a shared recognition that isolation was more dangerous than coordination. And now that alliance is being tested in real time by the uranium confrontation. Reports indicate that Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has placed its forces on heightened alert in a signal of solidarity with Niger. Whether this represents a credible military posture or a diplomatic gesture is a question that analysts are actively debating. But the symbolism is undeniable, and in geopolitics, symbolism carries weight. Ibrahim Traoré is arguably the most ideologically vocal of the Sahel's military leaders. His public addresses have consistently framed the region's struggles in explicitly anti-colonial terms, drawing direct lines between French corporate interests and the perpetuation of African poverty. His government expelled French ambassador Luc Holade, terminated French military presence on Burkinabe soil, and has made the alignment with the broader anti-French sentiment in the region a centerpiece of its domestic legitimacy strategy. When Ouagadougou places its forces on alert in solidarity with Niamey, it is not simply a military signal. It is a political declaration, a message to France, to the African Union, to the United Nations, and to the watching world. The Sahel is no longer a space where former colonial powers can operate with the impunity of the 20th century. What you are witnessing is not a mining dispute. That framing undersells the depth of what is happening here. This is a fundamental renegotiation of the postcolonial order in West Africa, one that involves nuclear energy supply chains, regional military alliances, the credibility of French foreign policy, and the aspirations of populations who have spent decades at the bottom of an economic hierarchy designed to keep them there. The uranium sites are the trigger. The underlying confrontation is about who controls Africa's resources, who benefits from their extraction, and what sovereign rights actually mean in practice rather than in theory. France's relationship with its former African colonies has long operated under a framework that critics describe as Francafrique, a system of political, military, economic, and cultural ties that maintained French influence across the continent long after formal independence was granted. At the heart of Francafrique was a tacit understanding. African governments would maintain agreements favorable to French corporate and strategic interests, and in return, Paris would guarantee political protection, security assistance, and diplomatic support. The system worked for France. For African populations, it delivered far less. And the generation now running the Sahel's military governments grew up watching it fail them. The uranium agreements that govern Orano's operations in Niger were products of that era, negotiated under conditions that critics have long questioned, involving governments whose legitimacy and independence were themselves compromised by French patronage. These contracts allocated extraction rights and revenue splits that, by any contemporary standard of resource nationalism, appear deeply unfavorable to the host country. Niger earns a fraction of what its uranium generates in terms of French energy security. This is not a contested claim. It is documented in comparative resource economics. The junta's decision to reframe the mining dispute as an act of national sovereignty is therefore not merely rhetorical. It draws on a factual record of asymmetric extraction that is difficult for any honest observer to dismiss. But sovereign resource claims, however justified their historical foundation, do not exist in a vacuum. France is not the only actor with skin in this game. The European Union, as a bloc, has significant interests in the stability of uranium supply chains. Nuclear energy is experiencing a political rehabilitation across Europe as governments grapple with the combined pressures of climate commitments, energy security concerns exposed by the Russia-Ukraine war, and the political difficulty of maintaining public support for fossil fuel transition. In this context, Niger's uranium is not simply a French concern. It is a European energy security concern, and that expands the diplomatic pressure that Niamey faces, even as it expands the coalition of interests France could potentially mobilize. At the same time, the geopolitical map of Sahel influence is being redrawn, with new actors moving decisively into spaces that France is vacating. Russia, through the Wagner Group's African operations, now operating under the rebranded Africa Corps following Prigozhin's death, has established a security presence in Mali and is reported to be active in Burkina Faso. The nature of that presence, the terms of the agreements governing it, and the extent of Wagner or Africa Corps' operational footprint remain subjects of active intelligence debate. But the broad strategic direction is clear. Moscow is offering Sahel governments an alternative security partnership, one that comes without the political conditionality of Western partnerships. For juntas whose primary concern is regime survival and whose secondary concern is resource sovereignty, that offer is structurally appealing. China, characteristically, is operating on a longer timeline and with less rhetorical noise. Chinese state entities have existing mining interests across West Africa, and Beijing's consistent posture of non-interference in domestic political arrangements makes it an attractive partner for governments that have just expelled a former colonial power. China does not lecture about democracy. China does not tie investment to governance benchmarks. China builds roads, mines resources, and maintains the bilateral relationship regardless of who is in power. For the Sahel juntas, that consistency is a feature, not a bug. What this means practically is that if France takes aggressive action to protect its uranium interests, whether through economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, or some form of punitive intervention, it risks accelerating the very realignment it is trying to prevent. Every punitive measure Paris takes against Niamey becomes a data point that the junta can use to justify turning further toward Moscow or Beijing. The harder France pushes, the more it validates the narrative that Western partnerships are coercive rather than cooperative. This is the strategic trap in which Paris finds itself. The tools available to it risk producing outcomes worse than the problem they are meant to solve. The regional implications extend beyond the immediate parties. Nigeria, the giant of West Africa and the dominant power in the economic community of West African states, faces its own complex calculus. ECOWAS initially threatened military intervention following Niger's coup, a threat driven substantially by Nigerian President Bola Tinubu's position as the bloc's rotating chair and his public commitment to reversing the coup. That threat was never executed. It ran into the hard wall of domestic Nigerian politics, where the National Assembly declined to authorize military action and where public opinion was deeply divided. Nigeria shares a long border with Niger. Any instability in Niger, any military escalation triggered by the uranium dispute, would send refugee flows, security spillovers, and economic shocks across that border. Lagos and Abuja need the uranium crisis to de-escalate, even as they publicly maintain the position that Niger's coup was illegitimate. This creates a multi-layered gridlock. France cannot act without risking deeper regional alienation. ECOWAS cannot enforce its own red lines without Nigeria committing forces it is politically unable to commit. The Alliance of Sahel States is projecting unity, but is also facing the practical challenge that coordinated military posturing is expensive, and Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are all managing significant internal security threats from jihadist insurgencies that have not disappeared simply because the political optics have shifted. The region's instability is not just a French problem or a sovereignty problem. It is a governance problem, a development problem, and a security problem layered on top of each other with no clean solution visible from any angle. For ordinary Nigerians, the uranium dispute is experienced through a particular and painful lens. Niger is a country where a significant percentage of the population lacks reliable electricity, and yet the uranium that powers French homes has been extracted from Nigerian soil for decades. The injustice of that arithmetic is not lost on the people living it. Whatever one thinks of the junta's legitimacy or methods, the popular resonance of its sovereignty framing is real and deeply rooted. When the military government of Niamey says it is reclaiming national resources for the Nigerian people, it is making a political claim that connects with genuine historical grievance. The question of whether that claim will translate into actual improvements in Nigerian living standards, better schools, reliable electricity, functioning healthcare, is one that the junta has yet to answer convincingly. But in the political short term, the claim works. And that popular legitimacy is part of what makes the situation so resistant to easy outside pressure. The diplomatic channels between Paris and Niamey are described as strained, and that is almost certainly an understatement. France has not formally recognized the Tiani government. The bilateral relationship operates in a kind of liminal space, where governments that do not recognize each other's legitimacy are nonetheless forced to engage over contracts, assets, and escalating threats. This is a space where miscalculation is genuinely dangerous. When formal diplomatic channels are degraded, and when military forces on both sides of the alliance equation are moving into elevated alert postures, the margin for error shrinks. A single incident, a disputed act at a mining site, an unauthorized personnel movement, a confrontation at a checkpoint, could escalate in ways that are difficult to walk back once they begin. France has domestic political pressures of its own that complicate the picture. French public opinion on Africa is shifting. A younger French public, more ethnically diverse and more critical of colonial history, is less instinctively supportive of the kind of muscular post-colonial resource protection that previous French governments could pursue with relative impunity. The far right, paradoxically, has its own nationalist critique of French Africa policy, arguing that French governments have spent too long propping up unstable African governments, and that France should prioritize its own interests more directly. The center, meanwhile, is caught between economic pragmatism and the political cost of appearing to bully a poor African country over nuclear fuel. President Macron, who has spoken publicly about the need to rethink France's Africa relationship, now faces the test of whether that rhetoric translates into a genuine strategic recalibration or whether economic and energy interests ultimately override the new approach. What happens in the coming weeks and months could genuinely redefine the terms of France's presence in West Africa, not just in Niger, but across the broader region. If Paris secures its uranium interests through some form of negotiated arrangement, It will have demonstrated that even with depleted political influence, France can protect its core strategic assets through economic leverage and diplomatic pressure. If Niamey successfully asserts sovereignty over the mining sites with meaningful support from the Alliance of Sahel States, it will have established a precedent that African military governments, operating collectively and with alternative security patrons available, can rewrite the terms of resource extraction agreements negotiated in the colonial era. That precedent would be watched closely, very closely, by governments across the continent with their own fraught resource histories with former European powers. The international community's response has been characteristically fragmented. The African Union has called for dialogue and political resolution while stopping short of endorsing either the junta's sovereignty claims or France's contractual position. The United Nations has expressed concern about stability without offering the kind of meaningful structural intervention that the situation would require to genuinely resolve. The United States, preoccupied with its own geopolitical priorities and historically ambivalent about Sahelian instability, has maintained a relatively low profile. Though Washington has its own concerns about Russian and Chinese inroads in the region and watches the uranium dispute through the lens of great power competition rather than resource justice. This is what makes the Sahel crisis so analytically rich and politically dangerous at the same time. It is simultaneously a post-colonial resource dispute, a nuclear energy security crisis, a regional military confrontation, a test of alliance cohesion, and a proxy arena for the broader contest between Western and non-Western geopolitical frameworks. None of these layers can be resolved independently of the others, and every actor involved is operating with incomplete information, significant domestic pressures, and a strategic environment that is shifting faster than established policy frameworks can adapt. The uranium beneath Niger's soil did not change. The reactors in France that depend on it did not change. What changed is the political context in which the extraction relationship operates, and that context has shifted decisively toward a world in which African governments, however imperfect their own governance credentials, are less willing to accept the terms of the old order and more willing to use the leverage of resource sovereignty to force renegotiation. France is not facing a rogue government making unreasonable demands. France is facing the structural consequence of a decades-long system that prioritized French energy security over Nigerian development, and the political generation that grew up under that system has now run out of patience. What the Sahel is telling the world right now, in the language of military alerts and mining disputes and strained diplomatic cables, is that the post-colonial compact is over. It has not been replaced by anything stable or just or comprehensively better. That is an honest acknowledgement that must be made. Military governments are not democratic liberation movements. The Alliance of Sahel States is not a utopian project. Ibrahim Traoré and Abdourahamane Tiani are not idealists. They are pragmatic military leaders whose political survival depends on the maintenance of a nationalist narrative. But their capacity to challenge French interests, to do so with apparent regional support, and to potentially succeed in rewriting the terms of resource extraction despite French warnings. This is new. The capacity exists. The political will exists. And the international context, from Wagner's presence to China's investment to a globally resurgent resource nationalism, provides the structural conditions in which that capacity can be exercised. The uranium dispute is the flashpoint, but the fire it threatens to ignite is much larger. A comprehensive restructuring of how Africa's resources are governed, who benefits from their extraction, and what role former colonial powers are permitted to play in economies they helped design to serve their own interests. France is not simply defending a mining contract. It is defending the last remaining architecture of a relationship model that the Sahel has formally rejected. And Niger, standing at the center of this confrontation with uranium beneath its feet and an alliance of like-minded governments at its back, is forcing the question that the international community cannot indefinitely defer. Can the old order hold? Or are we watching, in real time, the first stages of its replacement, with all the instability, danger, and genuine possibility that such a transition carries? The answer will not come from a single negotiation or a single threat or a single military alert. It will emerge from the accumulated decisions of governments, populations, and international actors who are all, right now, trying to read a map that has not yet been fully drawn. What happens next in the Sahel will not stay in the Sahel. The world is watching, and whether it fully understands it yet or not, it has a stake in the outcome.